Briarwood, Michigan, 2020. A small, peaceful town nestled in the rolling hills of the American Midwest, its streets lined with quaint homes and tall oak trees. Here, life moves slowly, dictated by the rhythm of the seasons and the unwavering routines of its residents. It's a place where faith and family values rule, where secrets are buried beneath smiles and polite greetings. In Briarwood, nothing is ever truly hidden, but everyone tries. Emily Harris, a woman in her early 30s, fit the role of a model wife and mother to perfection. Her days were spent in the quiet rhythm of suburban life, making breakfast for her 2 children, attending church services every Sunday, volunteering at community events, and always putting the needs of her family first. To the outside world, she was the epitome of devotion. She had a good life. Or so it seemed. But behind the perfect veneer, Emily was suffocating. She loved her husband, Mark, but their marriage had slowly turned into a hollow echo of what it once was. Mark Harris was a good man, solid, dependable, and steady. A man who worked long hours in the insurance business to provide for his family. A man who believed that love could be measured in paychecks and the roof over his family's head. He was not a man of grand gestures or deep emotional conversations. He showed his love through his hard work, his quiet, stoic presence at home, and his belief that stability was enough. But Emily needed more. She needed to feel seen. To be truly understood. And lately, she felt more invisible than ever. The loneliness settled in like a heavy fog, creeping through the corners of her mind, suffocating her thoughts. Emily tried to fill the void with her church work, with the constant hustle of running a household, but no matter how hard she tried, the emptiness remained. She wasn't sure when it started, the aching feeling of disconnect, but it had grown so loud that it drowned out everything else. Every day she woke up beside Mark, but it was like waking up in a room full of people who didn't know her at all. The distance between them was palpable. Mark, caught up in his work and his rigid ideas of what a marriage should be, never seemed to notice. She longed for more, something deeper, something that could reach her soul. But she didn't know how to voice that need, or if she even could. Then came Ethan Miller. He arrived in Briarwood in the late spring of 2020, just as the world was slowly beginning to recover from the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. The world had changed, but Briarwood remained untouched by the chaos, a quiet refuge from the outside world. Ethan, a 30-something Army officer, had been stationed at nearby Fort Grant, a military base just outside the town. He was tall, with a military posture that demanded attention, and a smile that easily won people over. But it wasn't just his physical presence that made him stand out. Ethan had a certain charisma that made people want to listen to him, to be near him. When he was invited to speak at a community fundraiser for veterans, it was the first time Emily truly noticed him. He spoke with such intensity and sincerity, recounting his years in the military with vivid detail, his eyes alight with passion. His voice was steady, yet imbued with the kind of quiet confidence that drew everyone in. Emily, standing in the back of the church hall, found herself captivated. She had heard his stories about the battlefield, about sacrifice, about the weight of responsibility, but it wasn't just his stories that caught her, it was the way he made her feel seen. His words reached into her chest, pulling at a part of her she had long neglected. For the first time in a long while, Emily felt something stir inside her. She felt alive. The connection between them was electric, undeniable, but neither of them acknowledged it. Not at first. As the fundraiser came to a close, Emily was part of the crowd gathered to thank Ethan for his speech. She made her way toward him, and their eyes met. There was a moment, just a flicker, where time seemed to slow. They exchanged pleasantries, light conversation, nothing out of the ordinary, but the air between them felt thick with unspoken words. As she smiled and turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something had shifted, not in the world, but inside of her. The next Sunday at church, Ethan was there. He had been attending regularly since he arrived in Briarwood, and Emily found herself watching him from across the room, her heart beating faster than it should have. He smiled at her from across the aisle, a smile that felt too warm, too familiar, for a man she had just met. They exchanged pleasantries after the service, nothing more than casual small talk. But to Emily, it felt like the beginning of something more. It didn't take long for their paths to cross again. At another church event, they found themselves standing next to each other, their conversation flowing easily. She found herself opening up to him about things she hadn't shared with anyone. Her longing for a deeper connection. Her feelings of loneliness in a marriage that no longer felt like it was hers. As Ethan listened, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of being truly heard. For the first time, someone was looking at her, really looking at her. It was intoxicating, this feeling of being understood. Ethan, too, began to open up about the difficulties of his career, the burden of constant duty, the isolation of military life. He spoke of a longing for something more, something real. And in that moment, in the quiet of their shared vulnerability, Emily felt a pull. A magnetic connection that neither of them could explain but both felt. Their friendship deepened, each encounter more personal than the last. They began to meet for coffee after church, their conversations lasting longer, veering into more intimate territory. Emily began to look forward to these meetings. And in the quiet of her heart, she knew something was beginning to grow between them. Something dangerous, something that could break her life apart. But she couldn't stop it. Neither of them could. And so, without realizing it, Emily Harris stepped onto a path from which there would be no turning back. As the weeks passed, the connection between Emily and Ethan grew undeniably stronger. It began with small moments, casual conversations after church services, quick exchanges during community events, moments where their eyes met and lingered just a second longer than necessary. But what started as a polite acquaintance soon blossomed into something much more intense, and neither of them could ignore it any longer. Emily, despite her best efforts to bury the longing, couldn't help but feel a magnetic pull every time Ethan entered the room. His presence was a sharp contrast to Mark's steady but emotionally distant demeanor. With Ethan, it was as if every word he spoke reached deep into her, touching a part of her soul she thought was lost forever. He seemed to understand her without even trying, something Mark had never done, despite all the years they'd spent together. One Sunday afternoon, after a particularly moving sermon, Ethan and Emily found themselves walking outside the church together, the afternoon sun filtering through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the pavement. They were alone, the rest of the congregation still gathered inside, talking amongst themselves. Ethan turned to her, his voice quieter than usual, his eyes intense yet gentle. "I noticed how you've been looking a little distant lately," he said, his words not accusatory, but filled with quiet understanding. Emily hesitated, her heart pounding. She had spent so much time pretending everything was fine, but Ethan's observation cut through the facade she had carefully constructed. Emily started, her voice faltering, "I feel like I've been living in a world that doesn't quite fit me anymore. Like I'm constantly, just going through the motions. You know?" Ethan nodded, his expression softening. "I get that," he said quietly. "Sometimes, it feels like we're just running in circles, trying to keep up with everyone else, but forgetting who we really are." They stood there for a long moment, the weight of their shared silence speaking louder than words ever could. It was in that silence that Emily realized just how much she was craving this connection, this unspoken understanding. It was as if Ethan had been able to read her soul, a soul she had kept hidden from everyone, even herself. "I don't know how to fix it," Emily whispered, more to herself than to him. Ethan's gaze never wavered. "You don't have to fix anything. Sometimes, you just need to talk it out. And you don't have to do it alone." The sincerity in his voice pierced through the confusion swirling in her mind. She wasn't alone. For the first time in what felt like years, someone someone who truly understood her, was standing right beside her, not asking for anything, just offering a safe place. Over the following weeks, their friendship deepened. They shared more intimate conversations, exploring the emotional terrain that both of them had spent years avoiding. Emily found herself opening up to Ethan in a way she never had with Mark. The vulnerability she had suppressed for so long, the yearning for emotional intimacy, poured out in quiet, late-night conversations, away from prying eyes. One evening, as they sat in a quiet corner of a local cafe, Emily confided in Ethan about the loneliness she felt in her marriage. She told him about the growing distance between her and Mark, how the man she married seemed like a stranger to her now. Ethan listened intently, his gaze never leaving her face, as if every word she spoke mattered more than the last. "I've tried to talk to him," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but it's like he doesn't hear me. I don't know what to do anymore." Ethan's response was slow, measured. "Maybe he's not the one who needs to hear you," he said softly. "Maybe it's time you started speaking to yourself." "What is it you really need, Emily?" Her heart raced. The question hung in the air like a challenge. What did she need? Was it too late to ask for something more than the life she had? "I just want to feel seen," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I want to be understood. I want someone to look at me and know what I need, without me having to say it out loud." Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "I see you, Emily. I see you." The simple declaration hit her harder than she expected. She had heard similar words from Mark over the years, but it had never felt the same. It had never felt like the truth. But with Ethan, it felt different. His gaze wasn't clouded by routine or obligation. It was pure, and in that moment, Emily felt like she was finally being seen for who she truly was. The bond between them only grew from there. They began to seek each other out more frequently. They met for long walks in the park, where they would talk about everything and nothing. Their conversations ranged from light-hearted banter to deeply personal confessions. It wasn't just about physical attraction, it was the emotional intimacy, the understanding, the companionship that grew with each passing day. Emily had spent years with Mark, but with Ethan, she felt a spark, an energy that was different, that was new. It wasn't about fixing her marriage, it was about feeling something again. She felt like she was waking up from a long sleep, her heart beating with a rhythm she hadn't known in years. And yet, with every passing moment, guilt gnawed at her. She knew she was treading dangerous ground. She knew that if anyone found out about the growing connection between her and Ethan, it would tear apart everything she had spent years building. But the pull between them was undeniable. And no matter how hard Emily tried to fight it, she knew that the lines between friendship and something more were beginning to blur. The truth was, she didn't know how much longer she could keep denying it, or how much longer she could keep this secret hidden from Mark. Her world was changing, and she couldn't stop it. And neither could Ethan. The growing connection between Emily and Ethan had become a secret they could no longer deny. What started as an innocent bond built on shared vulnerability had transformed into something more intense, more dangerous. As the weeks turned into months, the small moments of stolen glances and quiet conversations became harder to ignore. Emily found herself looking forward to every encounter with Ethan, every touch that lingered just a little too long. But with each passing day, the weight of what they were doing grew heavier, pressing on her chest like a vice. The cracks in her marriage with Mark were no longer just subtle hints, they were gaping chasms that seemed impossible to ignore. Mark, oblivious to the emotional distance between them, continued to bury himself in his work, believing that providing for his family and maintaining a stable life was enough. But Emily felt suffocated by the silence between them. The emptiness in their home echoed louder than the love they once shared. She couldn't help but wonder if it had always been this way, only now, with Ethan's presence in her life, the contrast was so stark. One night, after a particularly exhausting day, Emily found herself sitting in the living room of their home, staring at the soft glow of the television. Mark was in his usual chair, engrossed in a game on his phone, the familiar hum of their evening routine playing out. The silence was unbearable, and Emily could feel her heart pounding in her chest, knowing that the moment she had been dreading was approaching. The facade was about to crack. "Emily," Mark's voice cut through the silence, his tone hesitant. "We need to talk." Her stomach twisted, and for a split second, she considered pretending everything was fine. But she couldn't. Not anymore. The weight of the secret was suffocating her, and she knew that sooner or later, it would spill over. Mark set down his phone and turned to face her, his brow furrowed with concern. "I've noticed something," he said slowly. "You've been distant. Not just from me, but from everyone. From the kids, from the church, from everything. You're not the woman I married." His words struck her like a punch to the gut. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The guilt she had been carrying, the guilt that had gnawed at her every waking moment, flooded her system, choking her. "I'm fine," she finally managed to say, her voice trembling. "Just tired." "It's nothing." But Mark wasn't convinced. His eyes searched hers, looking for something, anything, that would make sense of the growing distance between them. "It's not just that. I know something's wrong. You've been different." Emily's heart raced. This was the moment. She could feel the walls closing in on her, and the truth was hanging by a thread. She could lie, tell him it was just stress, just a phase, but she knew that wouldn't be enough. He could sense it now, the change in her. She could see the doubt beginning to form in his eyes. The doubt that would eventually unravel everything. For the first time in years, Emily looked at her husband, really looked at him, and realized that despite all his hard work and efforts, he had never truly seen her. He had never understood what she needed, what she longed for. And she, in turn, had never been able to communicate that to him. The distance between them was not just emotional, it was a chasm that had grown wider with each passing year. Emily began, her voice faltering, "I've been feeling lost, Mark. I don't know how to explain it. I'm not happy. Not with you, not with myself. I don't know where I am anymore." The words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, Mark was silent. His face softened, and Emily could see the hurt in his eyes. "I don't understand," he whispered, his voice breaking. "We're supposed to be a team. We've always been a team." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to tell him everything, the loneliness she had felt, the way she had turned to Ethan for the connection she couldn't find at home, but the words stuck. How could she tell him that she had crossed a line, that she had found someone else who made her feel alive? The shame was unbearable. "I'm sorry," she whispered, barely able to look him in the eye. "I don't know how to fix this." Mark's expression darkened, and for the first time, Emily saw the suspicion in his eyes. It wasn't just concern anymore. It was something else. Something darker. "I don't believe you," he said softly, his voice cold. "You're hiding something, Emily. I can see it. And I don't know what it is, but I'm going to find out." The room seemed to close in around her. Emily could feel the walls pressing down, the weight of her secret crushing her. She wanted to scream, to confess, to beg for forgiveness, but the words were locked inside her. She had never wanted to hurt Mark. She had never wanted things to go this far. But now, it was too late. The tension in the room was unbearable, and Emily knew that whatever happened next, their lives would never be the same. She had crossed a line that once crossed, could never be undone. Her heart ached with the realization that the trust between them, the foundation of their marriage, was irreparably shattered. And as Mark stood up and walked toward the door, his back rigid with anger and confusion, Emily felt the weight of the choice she had made. She had opened a door she couldn't close again. The days that followed Mark's confrontation were a blur of tension and guilt. Emily tried to go about her usual routine, but it felt like a facade too fragile to maintain. The weight of her secret pressed on her chest with every breath. She felt suffocated by the distance between her and Mark, but even more so by the growing intensity of her feelings for Ethan. It wasn't just a passing attraction anymore. It was an emotional need, one that had slowly but surely consumed her. Every interaction with Ethan left her heart racing, her thoughts spinning. Each smile, each word they exchanged felt like a promise of something more, something real. She was no longer just seeking an emotional connection, she was falling. And she knew that with every passing day, the line between right and wrong was becoming more and more blurred. It wasn't just the betrayal of Mark anymore, it was the betrayal of herself. On a quiet evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Emily sat in the living room of their home, staring blankly at the TV. Mark was in the kitchen, his back turned as he prepared dinner in the same routine way he always did. It felt like they were living parallel lives, barely touching, coexisting without truly existing together. Emily couldn't remember the last time they had laughed together, or even had a meaningful conversation. The love she once thought was solid had turned to ash, leaving only the remnants of a marriage that seemed beyond repair. Then, the doorbell rang. Her heart leapt in her chest as she looked at the clock, late for any visitor, but she knew who it was. Without thinking, she stood and walked to the door. As she opened it, there he was, Ethan, standing in the soft glow of the porch light, his expression unreadable, but his eyes locked on hers. Without a word, he stepped forward, closing the door behind him as he entered their home. "Emily," he said softly, his voice filled with something unspoken. He was always careful with his words, always aware of the fine line they were walking. But tonight, it was different. There was an urgency in his voice, a rawness that reflected the same feelings Emily had been trying to suppress. She swallowed, feeling a wave of heat flush her face. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, but deep down, she knew. She had been waiting for this moment, even if she had never admitted it to herself. Ethan had become more than just a friend. He had become an escape from the suffocating reality of her marriage. And now, he was standing in front of her, the temptation she had fought so hard to resist. "I can't keep pretending, Emily," he said, his voice low but firm. "I can't keep watching you suffer, and I can't stand seeing you stuck in a life that isn't what you want. You deserve more than this." She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words deep in her bones. The guilt that had been gnawing at her, the guilt that had kept her awake at night, now flooded her in waves. Ethan was right. She deserved more. She deserved to feel alive, to feel seen, to feel loved. But could she really walk away from everything? She turned away, running a hand through her hair, struggling to find the words. "I can't do this," she muttered under her breath, though even as she said it, a part of her knew it wasn't true. A part of her was ready to let go of the life she had built, to step into a future that was unknown but felt more real than anything she had experienced in years. "You don't have to decide tonight," Ethan said, stepping closer, his presence overwhelming in the quiet room. "But you need to make a choice, Emily. Because staying in a life where you're miserable is only going to destroy you. You can keep living a lie, or you can take control of your happiness. But I'm not going to wait forever." His words hung in the air, and the silence that followed was deafening. Emily's mind raced as she looked at Ethan, his face inches from hers. Every part of her screamed to give in, to walk away from the life that had held her captive for so long. But another part of her, the part that had been married to Mark for over a decade, the part that still cared for him despite everything, fought to hold on to the past, to preserve the family she had built. She stepped back, feeling as if the ground beneath her was shifting, slipping away. "I can't just leave him. I can't tear apart everything," she said, her voice trembling. She knew that if she made this choice, if she chose Ethan, she would be destroying her marriage. She would be shattering the trust that had already been fractured. Mark would never forgive her. And what about the kids? What kind of example would she be setting for them? Ethan took a step forward, gently cupping her face in his hands. You don't have to tear anything apart, Emily. You've already been torn apart. This isn't about him. It's about you. About what you need, what you want. I'm not asking you to hurt anyone. I'm asking you to stop hurting yourself. Her breath hitched as tears welled up in her eyes. The weight of her decision was crushing her, and yet, in some strange way, she felt lighter. This was it. The moment where everything she had been running from came to a head. She had to choose. And choosing Ethan meant letting go of the life she had known. I don't know what to do, she whispered, her voice breaking as she looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with tenderness. You don't have to know right now. But you will, Emily. You will. It was in that moment, as their faces were inches apart, their breaths mingling in the heavy air, that Emily felt the world shift. She realized that she couldn't keep living a lie, couldn't keep ignoring her own needs, her own desires. She had spent years denying herself, burying her feelings beneath the weight of obligation. And now, for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of clarity. But the decision was still hers to make. The days after Emily's conversation with Ethan passed in a blur. Each moment felt like she was walking a tightrope, suspended above a chasm of consequences that could swallow her whole. The decision weighed heavily on her, yet she found herself unable to take a step back. Ethan's words echoed in her mind constantly, "You deserve more." And for the first time in a long while, she wondered if maybe he was right. But the life she had built with Mark, the family, the home, how could she just walk away from it all? As the tension between her and Mark continued to build, Emily's internal conflict became unbearable. Every time she saw him, the guilt would surge, a sharp, painful reminder of her betrayal. Mark remained unaware, his suspicions still simmering beneath the surface, but Emily knew the truth. And with each passing day, it became harder to lie to herself, harder to continue pretending that everything was fine. One evening, Mark finally confronted her again, his patience wearing thin. The distance between them had become too glaring for him to ignore. He had spent weeks watching Emily withdraw into herself, and the last shred of trust they had left was beginning to unravel. "Emily," Mark said, his voice strained but determined. "We need to talk. I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending like everything's okay." Her heart sank. This was the moment she had been dreading, the moment where all the lies would come crashing down. She had known it was coming, but she was still unprepared. Still, she could not bring herself to confess to him. To confess the truth that she had found someone else. Someone who made her feel something her marriage had not in years. I don't know what you mean," Emily stammered, her throat tight with emotion. Mark's face darkened, his eyes narrowing as he stared at her, searching for something, anything, he could cling to. "You've been acting strange, Emily. Distant. Secretive. And I know something's not right." The accusation hung in the air like a heavy fog. Emily felt herself tremble, torn between the man she had promised to love and honor, and the man who had awoken feelings inside of her that she never thought possible. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. It was as if the world had paused, waiting for her to speak the truth. But she didn't. She couldn't. Instead, she looked away, tears brimming in her eyes. "Mark, please. I don't know how to explain this," she whispered. I don't know what's happening anymore. I've tried so hard, but it's not enough." Mark took a step toward her, his expression softening, but the hurt in his eyes was undeniable. "I don't understand. I thought we were happy. We have a family. We have everything we need. So why are you pulling away from me? The question hung there, heavy and accusing, and Emily's silence only made it worse. She wanted to scream, to tell him everything, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she shook her head, too overwhelmed by the shame to speak. Is it someone else? Mark asked, his voice low, the vulnerability clear in his tone. Have you been seeing someone? Her chest tightened as she heard the words leave his lips. They were the ones she had feared the most, and now that they were out there, there was no going back. She nodded, barely able to meet his gaze, but it was enough. Enough for Mark to see it in her eyes. And then, everything changed. The look on Mark's face was like a gut punch. His shock quickly turned into something darker, something colder. He stepped back, shaking his head, his hand gripping the edge of the table as if it was the only thing holding him up. He began, his voice breaking. You've been lying to me. All this time. Behind my back. And I don't even know who you are anymore. Emily opened her mouth, but no words came out. The weight of the betrayal was too much for her to bear. She had destroyed him, not just by being unfaithful, but by shattering the trust they had built over the years. You didn't even have the decency to tell me the truth, Mark continued, his voice trembling with anger and pain. You've been so caught up in whatever this is that you couldn't even come to me, the man you swore to love. His words hit her like a physical blow. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the couch, tears streaming down her face. She had ruined everything. And the consequences of her choices were too great to undo. She had betrayed not only Mark but also herself. She had been running from her own dissatisfaction, her own unhappiness, and now it had caught up with her in the most devastating way possible. Mark, I'm so sorry, Emily choked out, but even as she said it, she knew the apology was meaningless. It could never undo the pain she had caused. Mark didn't respond. Instead, he turned away, walking to the door without another word. Emily watched him go, feeling the weight of the silence settle into her bones. The man she had loved for so long was leaving her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The world she had known was shattering, and with it, any chance of repairing the broken pieces of her marriage. The following days were a blur of emptiness. Mark left the house, staying with a friend, and the kids were too young to understand what had happened. Emily, left alone in the quiet house, felt the crushing weight of her decisions. Ethan, who had been the spark of excitement, of something more, now felt like a distant echo. She realized, too late, that her pursuit of passion had cost her everything, her marriage, her family, and her own sense of self. In the end, Emily learned the hardest lesson of all, that the consequences of our choices are often irreversible. We cannot undo betrayal, no matter how deeply we regret it. We cannot turn back time, no matter how much we wish we could. And, sometimes, seeking what we believe will make us happy only leaves us with emptiness and regret. The days that followed Mark's departure were a blur of numbness and regret. Emily sat alone in their once bustling home, staring at the empty spaces that now seemed to mock her. The silence was deafening, every corner of the house filled with echoes of the life she had once known. She spent her mornings in a fog, her afternoons pacing, consumed by the overwhelming weight of her decisions. And yet, even in the depths of her despair, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of clarity. The truth she had long buried was now impossible to escape, but it was also the only thing that could set her free. She had shattered the life she built with Mark, the man who had been her rock for so long. And the children, her heart broke at the thought of the pain she had caused them. The guilt weighed on her shoulders, a constant reminder of how far she had fallen from the person she once was. She thought about her marriage, the love they had shared, and how easily it all slipped away, unraveling thread by thread. The reality was stark, unforgiving. She had betrayed the one person who had trusted her, and the consequences were irreversible. The days were long, filled with endless self-recrimination. Emily thought about Ethan, too, the man who had made her feel alive again. But even his presence, once a comforting escape, now felt like another mistake. She had chosen him because he offered her something that had been missing in her marriage: passion, excitement, connection. But that excitement had come at a great cost. She realized now that the thrill of an affair could never replace the love, the trust, and the stability she had with Mark. It was in the quiet moments, those fleeting moments of clarity, that Emily realized the truth. She had made a grave mistake. Her heart ached not because of the passion she had sought, but because of the consequences she had to live with. The pain of losing Mark, of knowing she had irreparably hurt the man she once loved, was more devastating than anything she had imagined. And yet, she understood that this was the reality she had to face. With each passing day, Emily began to confront the harsh truth: she needed to rebuild. Rebuild not just her relationship with her children, but also herself. The person she had become, the woman who betrayed the one she loved, was not someone she wanted to be. She had to face her actions, own them, and learn from them. Mark, however, was not ready to forgive. His anger and hurt ran too deep. He couldn't just forget the betrayal, the lies, and the shattered trust. Emily tried reaching out, tried to explain the turmoil she had been living through, but Mark wasn't interested in hearing it. He had his own journey to embark on, his own healing to do. And while Emily understood that, it didn't make the pain of losing him any less. It wasn't just Mark she had lost. It was herself. She had been running from her own unhappiness, seeking solace in the wrong places. But now, in the wake of the wreckage she had created, Emily realized that she needed to find herself again. She couldn't undo the past, but she could choose to grow, to heal, and to become a better version of herself. She began to focus on her children, making sure they knew they were loved, that they weren't the cause of the pain she was going through. She worked to rebuild her life piece by piece, slowly regaining the trust she had lost. And while she knew the road ahead would be long, filled with pain and uncertainty, she also knew that it was the only road she could take. Emily had learned the hardest lesson of all, that choices, no matter how small they seem at the time, have far-reaching consequences. Our actions shape not just our own lives, but the lives of those we love. And once trust is broken, it's nearly impossible to fix. The lesson was harsh, but it was one she would carry with her for the rest of her life. In the end, Emily found a strange kind of peace. She wasn't happy, not in the way she had once been, but she was learning to live with her choices. To grow from them. And she hoped, in time, that she could rebuild the relationship she had with her children, and maybe, just maybe, with herself. What do you think about Emily's choices and the consequences she faced? Was she right to seek happiness outside her marriage, or did her decisions go too far? What would you have done in her situation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you want to see more of these thought-provoking stories. We'd love to hear your opinions and get your perspective on this tragic journey of love, betrayal, and self-discovery. Your comments matter.